In those days, the Crest was in service to the Shade, protectors of Heartvale. For hundreds of years, the hallowed Crest and Talon of Kiest has roamed these lands and seas, seeking out order and chaos. Though our religious connotations have long since passed with the death of our patron goddess, that purpose yet remains, albeit in a more pedestrian form. We, the mercenaries of the Crest, sell our blades in service of chaos when order must be disrupted, and to order when chaos veers out of control. I do not doubt our calling has never been clearer when facing these cultists of Vargaush. They are the embodiment of chaos, bent on turning this world to corruption and ash. As servants of the balance, it is our duty to see their deeds undone and their fell plans soiled. Whether the cult of Vargaush dies here or continues to suppurate elsewhere, we stand in good company with our forebears, and let it be written in this, the Book of Saga, as it was in the Book of Zevra the Untamed, that we of the Crest pursue our duty and our calling, that we have hunted these cultists from Heartvale to Davenar, and that tonight we strike our blades through their very hearts. Welcome back for another episode of Errant Adventures. As always, I'm your game master and solo player, Steve Morrison. It's the Season 2 finale, and my 100th episode. Thank you so much to all of you who've listened to this long season. It's been over a year, as well as just the rest of the show and all of my blatherings into this mic. Like I did last time at the end of the season, I'm happy to do a post-season wrap-up to answer any lingering questions. So if you have any questions, please send them to me at errantsolopod@gmail.com or hit me up on Twitter at errantsolopod. I'll plan to record that in early November, so you all will have all of October to get your questions in. I'm also planning on taking a break before jumping into Season 3, which will return to what I'm calling the Tarquin verse. But don't think that means you'll get a week off from hearing my dulcet tones in your ears, because I've got some awesome shorter form stuff, including some collaborations that I've done, coming up to fill in the gap. All right, I think that's enough for this overly long intro, so let's get to the show. On this week's episode, Ben and the others descend into the bowels of the temple to face off with the final cultist of Vargaush. Find out what happens on episode 55, In Those Days. Last time, the Crest began their assault on the Temple of Interves, where the Vidala have been hiding. Arid enacted a ritual that mostly worked to protect the soldiers of the Crest from the corruption of the cult of Vargaush. The soldiers of the Crest headed to the canal, slipped across into Mudside, and made their way towards the temple. Ben managed to quietly take out the guard who was protecting the entry to the temple, and Lephalia used her talent to pull aside the magical protective barrier that the Vidala had erected around this temple, in so doing alerting the Vidala to their presence. Guards poured out and battle was joined. Very quickly, Ben, Arid, and Orchid managed to bypass the majority of the guards outside who were fighting the rest of the Crest in the streets, and they were able to enter the sanctum of the temple, where they found Cleofa Vidala and a creature that she had summoned. They fought, and while Ben was able to relatively quickly strike down Cleofa Vidala, the creature wreaked havoc on them, and Ben and Orchid came away with pretty severe injuries. Still, they defeated the creature, and then, gathering themselves, injured and exhausted, they descend into the caverns below the temple to face the final cultist of Vargaush. Ben, Arid, and Orchid descend the stone steps beneath the temple to Intervess, making their way towards the inner sanctum, the final defensive point for the Vidala. Ben is holding his side and his injuries. Orchid is bleeding from multiple lacerations and places where the acidic blood of Cleophas' creature burned their skin. Arid is trying to clear his mind and focus on continuing to protect them from the pressure of corruption that lies in the air. They make their way down the steps, down deeper into the earth, and it becomes cooler, and there's a dampness in the air as they reach a stone floor that leads to an archway into the central cavern underneath the temple. As they approach, we should ask the fate chart. Did Cleopha buy her mother enough time to enact some sort of ritual? I think the answer is very likely, because they had so much trouble defeating the creature that she summoned. I think it's very likely that they were delayed long enough for her to finish whatever ritual she was performing. So let's go ahead and ask the fate chart that. Very likely, chaos rank of 7. 22, which is a yes, and also a random event. So let's find out what this event focus is first, and then we can go from there. 23. NPC action. So we have 6 NPCs. We've got Irongull, Lephalia, the Vidala family, Gillen, Erdira the Shade, and Hadrius Decaro. So I'm going to roll a d6 and see what we get. 1. Irongull. This is NPC action. Roll on our action and subject. 64 spy. And 43 competition. Spy competition. So this is an interesting and sort of tricky prompt because Irongull is currently embedded in conflict with the Vidala guards. And so if he spies competition, there really isn't much competition here, except they did bring those occult infiltrators from the Shade to the city. And while the Shade are allies, these infiltrators could be viewed as competition for their mission to defeat them. But I don't know that I want Irongull to necessarily try to waylay them, because I think he's smart enough to understand that they might be important. So what I'm going to say instead is that he is in the midst of this fight, and he is commanding the others, and he sees Ben, Arid, and Orchid slip into the temple. And then I think what he sees after that is a few of those temple guards breaking away from the combat and rushing back into the temple itself. I think he is confident that Ben, Arid, and Orchid can handle a few guards, but he doesn't know how many there might be inside. So I think he is going to push to try and overwhelm those outside. So we're going to ask the fate chart this. Is Irongull able to inspire his soldiers enough that they overcome the guards who are still remaining? looking at the clock that I made for them last time, it was a 12-part clock. We had 5 of the 12 parts marked off. So I think it is unlikely that he and the Crest are going to be able to overcome the remainder of these guards in time to offer aid to Ben and the others. So here we go. Asking the fate chart, 55% chance. 67 is a no. So Iron Gull sees this going on. He calls out. He says, "Crest, advance! Take the temple!" And they push forward, and the guards are falling back, and the battle is certainly turning away from these temple guards, but they're not going to defeat them quickly enough. So what that tells us is that some temple guards are going to come up behind Ben, Arid, and Orchid while they're underground. And we should go back to our question of whether or not the Mother of the Vidala was able to unleash this ritual. The answer was yes. So what is that ritual? I think that maybe we should roll up a spell on maze rats. And that will be the situation that Ben, Arid, and Orchid are walking into. So we're going to roll to generate the spell. A 5 and a 3. That is going to be physical element and physical form. So the physical element is going to be 1 and 6. Brine. Interesting. And the physical form, 5 and 5. Steed. Brine steed. So I think this is what happens. Ben, Arid, and Orchid emerge into the depths of this cave, and they see the Mother of the Vidala standing in front of this black Icarus pool, and she is chanting, and her hands are raised up, and she finishes chanting as they rush into the room. And she goes silent as they are now standing across from her on the other side of this pool. And I think Ben says, "Lady Vidala, I suggest you surrender now. Your children are dead, and you will join them soon if you don't stand down." I think that she looks at him, and she looks at Orchid, and she looks at Arid, and then she goes, "Fools, you think that you can destroy me in my own sanctum? I rule here, and you are going to be my puppets. The dread beetle strikes down upon you, and his corruption will overwhelm you." And as she is speaking, that Icarus black pool begins to bubble and roil, and this form begins to rise up out of the pool. And there is this shelled creature. It's not quite a beetle. It's almost like a crab or some sort of sea creature that rises up out of this. And she, with a surprising amount of dexterity, leaps onto the back of this creature. And as she does so, Ben, Arid, and Orchid hear the thundering of footsteps on the stone steps behind them. And I think Orchid turns and sees these guards charging down after them. And I think it's time for what may very well be the final fight for these Crest soldiers. Orchid sees these guards charging down behind, and they turn to the others, and they say, "Arid, Ben, I'll cover our rear." And they are going to turn with Bone Eater and stand in the doorway to hold back this wave of guards that is clattering down. And let's go ahead and just get right into it and roll engage in combat. And I just want to say, I think because there's a lot going on and because they're facing such a great challenge, and I was thinking about this after last episode, I don't necessarily want to revisit the idea of them having to roll every volley in order to make an action because of this corruption. So I think it makes sense that she had to draw in the corruption around her and use it in this ritual to summon this creature. So I don't think that this room is as full of that corruption of Vargaush as the sanctum in the temple above was. And so the baseline protections that Arid was able to produce are going to be enough to keep the corruption at bay while they face this summoned creature and this sorceress. Orchid has a fierce of 3. We're going to roll 2d6 and add +3. They have the move Send an Army for I Will Not Relent, which allows them to count as a small militia in combat. So this is not going to be a problem for them facing off against all these guards. Here we go. 10 on the dice +3 is a 13. So that means that we're going to deal potentially extra damage, and we are going to also stymie our opponent, be impressive or dominant, or achieve a goal. Orchid is going to attack with Bone Eater, which is 3 harm, and of course, going to battle aggressively. This was going to grant them +2 harm. That is going to give 5 harm, which is going to fill all but 2 sections on that mega clock. And unfortunately, they are going to take 3 harm, 2 of which will be absorbed by their armor, and that would mark their last point of harm. So I'm going to have Orchid roll taking harm. So when you suffer harm, roll plus harm suffered. So this is going to be +1 because the armor ate 2 points of that harm. And we're going to see what happens. And remember, we want to roll low on this one. 7 + 1 is an 8. So on a 7 and 9, the MC can choose one. You lose your footing, you lose your grip on whatever you're holding, you lose track of someone or something you're attending to, you miss noticing something important. Okay, so a couple things are going to happen here. First of all, we're not going to mark that harm. This consequence is in lieu of marking that 1 point of harm. So Orchid is still at 4 out of 5 harm, bleeding from multiple wounds, and they charge into the doorway. These guards are coming in, but there's not a whole lot of room to maneuver. So Orchid is able to cut through them. But I think at one point they lose hold of Bone Eater and it goes clattering to the floor. And then they draw out a dagger, and it is just all close in work as Orchid is wading through these guards, dagger stabbing out and puncturing through the cracks in their armor, as Orchid is a force of nature singing a Pheromorchian death chant and utterly obliterating these guards. And I think the 10+ on this is achieving a goal. Orchid prevents the guards from entering this main chamber. Ben and Arid are left to contend with the Mother of the Vidala and this creature that she has summoned, which I'm going to mark down as, again, a 6-part clock. Ben and Arid look at each other. Ben says, "Well, my friend, I suppose this is it. You think you can handle her?" "Of course. It would be my honor." And Ben is going to draw back with his short sword, and he is going to, though he is weakened, he is going to take a running charge and try to slash at this creature with his blades. This is going to be 2d6 + 1 because he is in a weakened state. 10 on the dice again, +1 is an 11. I think that Ben, having only 1 armor is going to parry their blows. But I think we should ask the fate chart, since this is a creature of the brine, of the sea, that the Mother of the Vidala has corrupted. Does it have some sort of like additional damage? Is it empowered in some way? I think it's not likely. I think there's no way that it's got superpowers. It's basically a giant crab, which means their armor should hold up all right. So I'm gonna say there's no way. 35% chance. Of course, I rolled a 19. So yes, so this is gonna deal 3 harm instead of 2 harm. And in that case, Ben is going to have to choose between taking a harm or dealing 1 less damage, but taking no harm whatsoever. And since he is sitting at 3 harm, I don't know. This is tough. He's going to fight defensively here. So he is charging in, but he's favoring his side, where the creature above, the sort of like werewolf creature that Cleophas summoned, slashed him across his abdomen and threw him into a pillar. He's favoring that side, and he charges forward and he stabs with his sword, and it manages to prick into this giant crab. And as its claw comes snapping back at him, Ben is going to duck and roll away. And we're going to mark 1 section of this 6-part clock as he focuses on the creature. I think because we got the 10+, stymie your opponent, that must change their behavior somehow. So I think what that means is he is presenting this creature with a target. And the creature is not fully cognizant of what's going on. It has just been drawn forth from below the surface, and maybe even the process of her summoning this thing transformed it from a normal small crab to something that's larger and more dangerous. And so it's a little disoriented, and it's focusing on Ben, and then it sees Arid, and then it's like turn, and there's noises coming from the hallway. And I think it's a little confused at the moment. So that will give Ben, I think, a better chance to continue to maneuver. While this goes on, the Mother of the Vidala looks down on them and, continuing to laugh, begins to chant. And Arid steps forward and says, "My lady, I do not wish to duel you with our talents, but if that is the course of action you have chosen, so let it be." And he will also chant back at her. And this is going to be Arcane Malice. He's going to roll engage in combat plus his arcane of 2. Here we go. 9 on the dice plus 2 is an 11. Okay, so let's go ahead and see what kind of spell Arid uses as he unleashes this attack. It is going to definitely be 2 damage here. And then we are going to go over to Maze Rats and roll. I think this is going to be a physical element and an ethereal form. 6 and 2. Vine and ethereal form. 1 and 2. Beacon. So I think he sees this sea creature that she's riding, and she's chanting, and these braziers on the walls around them, on the stone walls that are slick with moisture, begin to gutter, and green flames erupt from them as she is gathering them to strike down on Arid. And Arid, chanting, is going to turn one of those beacons into... It's still green, but instead of it being fire, it's a vine. A vine comes tendriling out of that flame, and it lashes around the Mother of the Vidala, and she cries out in pain as Arid is going to deal 2 damage. And also, because this is an engage in combat, he has to decide if he is going to parry their blows or fight defensively or battle aggressively. So Arid has 1 harm right now. There's a part of me that wants to battle aggressively because he's going to deal more harm, but he's going to take harm on himself because he has no armor. If he battles aggressively, he's going to deal 4 out of her 6 harm in this first go-around, which would be huge compared to dealing just 2. But it also puts him very close to death. I'm going to ask the fate chart here because I think this is important, because I said it was flames and he has had experiences of being burned. Is he going to battle aggressively or is he going to fight defensively? Thinking about it now, because it's fire, I think it is almost a near sure thing that he's going to fight defensively. So I think this is a chaos rank of 7 here. 26 is a yes. He is going to fight defensively. Okay, so that makes sense because it is fire. He wraps this vine around her and starts to pull her away from the shell of this creature that she's riding. And at the same time, he's pulling up a defensive barrier around himself. And so he is going to only deal 1 harm, but he is going to take no harm whatsoever as the flames wreathe around him. So we're going to mark off 1 out of the 6 sections of her clock, and then we are going to turn back to Orchid. Now, Orchid does not have Bone Eater in hand anymore. And since we unfortunately did not succeed on the roll that Iron Gull and the Crest would be able to join this fight and offer reinforcements, I think Orchid has to continue fighting these guards in order to hold them off. So they have their dagger, which deals 1 harm. They also have a small hammer. They're going to switch the dagger to their offhand, pull out the hammer, and they are basically just going at it in this small passageway. Once again, engaging in combat, +3 on the fierce, another 10 +3. That is going to wipe out the guards. Orchid successfully wipes out the guards, and I'm going to say, because I got a 10+, they are able to not only kill the guards that are in that tunnel, but they are able to then rush back out and pick up Bone Eater as they run back into the main chamber where the rest of this battle is going on. Then continuing to face off against this creature is, I think, going to attempt to strike at it again with his sword. There's not really much more he can do here, unless he has a similar thought that what he had before of, can he strike at the mother of the Vidala and therefore cut off the head of the snake, as it were. So we said before that this creature has been summoned and is a little disoriented. So does Ben have the chance to get around to one side and clamber up one of its legs and strike at the mother of the Vidala? I think it is 50-50. Chaos rank of 7. 86 is a no, so he is unable to. The crab's eyes turn and focus on him, and its claws click, clack as it gets ready to strike at him. And Ben is going to draw back with his blade and stab forth again. Here we go, engaging in combat. 6 on the dice, +1 is a 7. So he is successfully able to strike. Once again, we're going to fight defensively. He's only going to deal 1 harm to it, but he is going to take no harm himself. He's whittling away at its life force, and it clacks its claw over his head as he ducks under it and stabs up into its soft underbelly. But the creature is still standing as he's not able to get in close enough to drive the full length of his sword into the creature's body. Arid continues his chanting as he unleashes more arcane malice on the mother of the Vidala. 10 again, +2 is a 12. So he is going to deal 2 magical harm. Is he going to fight defensively? Is he going to parry their blows? I think once again, she is calling on this fire And this time, instead of fighting defensively, he is going to expose himself a little bit to it. So he's going to parry their blows, which means he's going to take his -1 harm. He's still going to take a harm. That'll take him up to 2 out of 5. And he is going to unleash his own 2 harm on her. That is going to fill her clock halfway, and let's see what this looks like. 5 and 5, which is ethereal effect and a physical element. 6 and 4, warding. And physical element. 2 and 6, fungus. Warding fungus. Okay, so I think there's moss and other growths on the walls of this wet, damp cavern. And he calls on those, and they start to writhe around him, basically forming armor around his body as this fire burns it away. And he gestures out his hand, and this fungus becomes a spear or a javelin, which he then throws, and it strikes into her side as she cries out once more. Now, Orchid has returned to the main chamber. They have Bone Eater in their hand, and I think they look at this creature, and Ben looks over at them and says, "Orchid, is there anything you can do about this?" And Orchid says, "Don't worry, my friend. I've got this." And they are going to charge with Bone Eater at this creature. And we're going to roll 2d6 plus fierce. 6 on the dice plus 3 is a 9. Orchid attacks with vigor. It deals 1 extra harm, which is going to be 4 harm, and that is enough to strike down this creature. Now, they are going to take 1 harm because of that, because they're not deflecting, and this creature has 3 out of 4 harm. I was going to say maybe they parry their blows, but Orchid is not concerned about that. So this is going to fill up their harm again. Let's go ahead and roll taking harm once more. 2d6 plus 1. 6 plus 1 is 7. You lose your footing. Okay, so once again, we're going to not mark that harm, and instead we are going to... So I read that wrong, and I've got to admit it. Hands off the chess piece for the first one, but for this one, I've got to do it the right way. So it's only on a miss can you actually choose something from the 7 to 9 list and then not suffer that harm. So not only does Orchid suffer that harm, which is going to fill up their track, but they also lose their footing, which I think makes sense because they're basically bleeding out. So I think this is what this looks like. Orchid charges forward, and Ben sees that. Ben tries to help out with his sword, and the creature bats Ben away, and then Orchid buries their axe into the creature's skull and drives Bone Eater through the hardened shell that is covering its face and its head. The shell cracks, and the creature stutter steps for a moment, and then there's a brief moment where the creature snaps with its claws, and Orchid's armor bears most of the brunt. The rending sound of armor can be heard as it crunches, and Orchid kind of lets out a gasp as their air is almost cut off by the pressure of the metal being bent inward. And the creature slumps down, and Orchid falls with it. And they are bleeding out on the cavern floor as the creature falls to ruin. And the Mother of the Vidala, does she make her escape from it, or does she fall and is in a moment of weakness here? Is she able to escape from it? I think it is unlikely. Chaos rank of 7. 81 is a no. So she hits the ground hard. In that case, Ben has an opportunity to step forward and gain the advantage. And I think to do that, he's going to have to face duress instead of engaging in combat, because this is less about trading blows, and this is more about taking advantage of this momentary distraction that she has. He steps forward, and we're going to roll plus steady, which is +3. 3 on the dice. +3 is a 6. Poor Ben. Missteps right at the most important moment. He steps forward with his blade ready to hold her at bay. But she is wily and ancient and powerful. And as he steps forward, she unleashes a gout of this green flame from these braziers directly on Ben. And I think he is going to have an opportunity to dive out of the way. Face duress once again. Plus steady. 5 on the dice. +3 is an 8. So you can achieve your goal, but it'll come at a price. You achieve your goal, but only partially. You cannot achieve your goal, but you can do something similar instead. I think he is going to take harm, but he's not going to take the full brunt of this harm. So I think he's going to take 1 harm from this. That takes him up to 4, and he dives to the ground as the flames lash around him. And since we've already been doing this with Orchid, we might as well go ahead and roll taking harm. +1. 7 + 1 is an 8. So he loses his footing. So he dives to the side and he clambers around as the flames have lit his clothing on fire, and he's sort of rolling around, patting himself out as Arid steps forward. The Mother of the Vidala rises. She rises from her position on the floor, and she looks across at Arid and she says, "Well, mage, it looks like you and I are the last to stand. Do you think that you can destroy me? Do you think that you can destroy the mighty rain wind? I who have pierced the shroud of Aelfheim and have returned with powers untold? Do you truly think, you puny little mage, that you can destroy me?" And he has nothing to say to that other than, "We are about to find out," as he engages in combat, unleashing his arcane malice on her. She unleashes her fury on him. 7 on the dice, +2 is a 9. He has 2 harm from his magic. He is going to attack with vigor and deal 3 harm. That will fill up her clock. Let's see what this magic that he unleashes looks like. 6 and 2 is a physical element and an ethereal form. The physical element, 4 and 2, obsidian. The ethereal form, 6 and 5, wave. A wave of obsidian. It's perfect. Okay, so she unleashes the fire on him, and he is going to take 2 harm from this as the flames lash over him, but he grits his teeth and he focuses and he calls out to the stone around him, the obsidian within this cave, and it rises up for a moment and writhes and shakes, and the floor ripples as she is cast down to her knees. And then he looks down at her as the flames burn away parts of his clothing and are singeing his skin, and he says, The cult of Vargaush is going to end here with you. I do not care who you are, only that you die. And the obsidian rises up over her, and there is a brief moment where she looks up and her eyes widen as she realizes that she can do nothing, and that obsidian crashes down upon her like a wave and drives her down into the earth, and she is completely sealed and entombed within the depths of this cavern. And the battle comes to an end. In the aftermath, Ben and Arid drag Orchid up the stone steps into the temple, where they find the occult infiltrators of the Shade. These infiltrators have slipped in past the battle, which sounds like it's winding down outside. And as Ben looks up at these veiled figures, he says, "Wolf's breath, where have you all been?" They say nothing as they stride past him and descend down into the bowels of the cavern behind them. Arid says, "Let us leave them to their work. They will make sure, I am certain, that there is no corruption remaining when we are gone. For now, let us see to our friend." Orchid is bleeding from many wounds, and Ben and Arid themselves are severely injured. But they drag Orchid outside to the streets of Mudside, where the rest of the Crest are standing. The Crest have suffered a number of injuries. 6 more of their number have been wounded severely or killed. There are 10 now, still standing, all exhausted and worn. Iron Gull himself, wiping blood away from a cut on his forehead, looks at them and says, "Is it done?" Ben nods and says, "Yes, it's done." "Good. Glad to hear it. Let's get out of here." And as they are preparing to turn away, they realize that there are a number of figures standing further down the street. Iron Gull grunts a little bit. Lephalia says, "And what now is this? More trouble?" A woman steps forward, smiling, and says, "Greetings, esteemed soldiers of the Crest. I applaud you on your tremendous accomplishment this day, and I offer you my aid." Iron Gull and Lephalia turn and look at each other and then back to this woman, and Iron Gull says, "Who are you?" Ben is the one who speaks and says, "Sergeant, might I introduce you to Sydney Caliver?" She smiles and says, "Yes, I have surgeons at the ready to help," and she snaps a finger and several men and women in clean clothing stride forward to help the wounded. She says, "I am ever interested in protecting my investments. Some of your number have agreed to do some work for me. I would hate for them to bleed out before they've had a chance to fulfill their part of our contract. Come now, let's get out of the street, and we can discuss the future elsewhere." We fade out, and a few days have passed. Ben, Arid, Orchid have all been tended to, as have the other members of the Crest. They're back at the Shivering Swan, recuperating, Ben walks into a small room where Orchid is laid up. Orchid, who has so much life and vitality, came ever so close to death. The Crest's own surgeon, Escorpheza, is going over their wounds one last time and then turns when Ben enters and smiles and nods and then steps outside. Orchid looks up at them and says, "Well, looks like I'm going to live after all." Ben smiles and says, "I'm glad to hear that, my friend. What an experience." Arid nods and says, "It was a lot, but we came through it gracefully, I think." Ben looks up at Arid and says, "Do you really think the cult is gone?" Arid thinks for a moment and says, "Who can say? We know that this particular branch has been cut, although I do not know what she meant by the words she spoke. Those last words." Then says, "What last words?" "She called herself by a name. What was it? Rainwind. She said that she pierced the shroud of Elfheim." I think Ben, for a moment, stumbles and then looks at Arid and says, "Rainwind? Are you sure that's the name she gave?" Arid nods and says, "Quite sure. Do you recognize it?" Ben nods and says, "I do. I read about her in the histories of Heartvale." "How do you mean?" "She was a powerful sorceress over 200 years ago who ruled the city as ducks for a number of years until eventually she gathered crew and sailed for the Shroud and then was never heard or seen of again. It seems unlikely that this same person that we've been pursuing this whole time could have been her, and yet, why would she call up that name? If it is true, I hope that she is in fact dead and gone, and not waiting another 200 years for some further ill deeds." Arid looks at Ben and says, "That is very curious, but don't worry, my friend. I think that the stone I crushed down upon her will be more than sufficient to put an end to her reign of terror. Yes, I think that the cult is no more. At least this branch, and for our part in it. It must be done. Of course, that is not to say that there are not other branches out there, and perhaps we will come across them again, as it seems we are fated to do. But perhaps there will be other soldiers of the Crest who will do those deeds, and we will not have to deal with that." "No, perhaps not. What do you think, Orchid?" Orchid shrugs and says, "I don't really care. Just looking forward to getting out of this bed. Getting a little tired of laying around doing nothing. I'm actually looking forward to this little heist we've got to do." Ben nods and smiles and says, "Yes, I believe Iron Gull was a little upset with me for having signed a contract without his authorization, but how can we do anything but honor it?" That's the trouble for another day, though. We've got some time before that comes up. In the meantime, rest up. Once our contract with Sydney Caliver has been closed, it'll be time to return to Heartvale, and we've been promised some rest. I think we've all earned that. We pull out of that small room. We see an image of the Shivering Swan and the soldiers of the Crest within. And then we pull back away and we see Davenar itself. This massive city built so tightly and compactly together. We soar across the sea and we see Heartvale, the merchant jewel of the Maracalaga. We see the bustling decks of the drift ships out in the harbor, a separate little city that stands just off the shore. The wave of their beliefs crashing over the harbor and into bright scales. We see the frail form of Lord De Soto as he knows that his days are coming to an end. We see the Royal Dispatch Company writing new plays and speeches, sending its agents here and there. We see the Shade and Lady von Triken walking the halls of the Duxit, sitting in council meetings, and then returning back to her estate and descending down deep into the depths of her vault, where she looks over the captured artifacts of Vargaush. We see the Crow's Nest, the focal point of the mercenary company known as the Crest. We see the recruits being brought in and trained. We see Captain Netheridge sitting at his table, writing in a ledger and studying the room around him. In those days, the Crest fulfilled its service to the Shade, protectors of Heartvale. Thanks for listening to Errant Adventures, and thank you so much to Syrinscape for the lovely ambient sounds and music throughout the episode. If you enjoyed the show, please tell anyone and everyone in your life about it. And if you want to support the show directly, leave me a review or buy me a coffee at coffee.com/errantadventures. That's ko-fi.com/errantadventures. If you want to interact with me, my handle on Instagram and Twitter is @errantsolopod, or you can email me at errantsolopod@gmail.com. I also post short fiction and campaign-related materials on my website, errantadventurespod.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time. We see a building at night. It's dark, and a hooded figure enters the building. It looks like a fortress, like a small prison. The figure enters, and a few of the guards see the figure and stand at attention. The figure shows them a badge, an emblem, a coin, and they stand aside. The figure ascends several flights of stairs and eventually comes to a hallway where there is a door at the far end. It leads to a small cell. When this figure unlocks the door of the cell, it swings open, and there is a woman inside. A woman with olive skin and dark curly hair. She looks up at the figure, and now, for the first time, we see the figure's face. It's Lady Wilhelmina von Triken, the Red Fox. And she looks down at this woman sitting on this small cot, and she says, "Ravia de Mezza, I've heard a lot about the accusations you have towards certain members of society. I'm curious. Do you want to stay here and rot away the rest of your life? Or are you interested in doing something about this little problem we have?" Ravia de Mezza stands and says, I'd like to do something about it, if you don't mind, your ladyship. The Red Fox smiles and says, Then come with me.